What can a 19th century Russian novel teach us artists living in the 2020s on the internet about what it is to create and live fearlessly? Honestly, more than you'd think, especially when it comes to sharing and self-sabotage and overthinking to the point of not actually creating anything and living up to your potential. So if you've ever overthought your art to the point of not making it, then Notes from the Underground has already diagnosed you over 150 years ago. So just a little bit of how I found this book very briefly. So the reason I found this book is, as you know, a working artist, your job is to be alone by yourself kind of the majority of the time. And this can lead to sort of chronic overthinking. And recently, in the last few years, I have had sort of my tendency to be sort of gregarious and just go with it and jump in feet first and why not make it and let other people tell you no. This mindset that has been nothing but helpful for me in my entire career, really challenged in three big ways with interactions with people. And a couple of instances, I've had students that I've worked very close with really talk to me about their perfectionism and how it's kept them from making. And one of the things that I thought was kind of the most jarring about these interactions is that they would make really good points and honestly get to the point where why make when there's such a slim chance of making it, and there seems to be so many different predatory galleries and magazines that benefit off of selling you the hope of being an artist when in reality it's a risky endeavor. But the final thing that pushed me over the edge to sit down and read this book and actually reread this book to make this video even over the last few months was an encounter I had with a family member who grew up in the same even household to me and lived with a father that to me is almost identical to the underground man. His way of thinking, the fact that he was incredibly smart but completely thwarted by inaction. And because of that, I had to take what was I think a very childish, but not wrong, rebellion to this way of thinking, this sort of, my dad was a Gen Xer and, was very jaded by life and had his own struggles and yet was very intelligent and very creative. This sort of cynical, analytical, oftentimes kind of correct in a lot of ways person, I ended up rejecting that and becoming an artist. And it wasn't until I approached my 30s where I sort of had this more analytical, well, what if they're right moment that I had to sort of take this head on and really reckon with it. And for me, reading this book was the cathartic push that I really needed to sort of feel better. And I'm hoping to explain my walk through the other end of this, because I think to summarize this entire book and to summarize what it is to kind of be an artist, and I would even venture a little bit further into what it's like to sort of be political and want to make change in the world right now, is to sort of resist being what I like to call dead right. And that leads us, of course, to our character. The book is pretty short. It's a novella. It's only about 100 pages long. And there are free audiobooks that are online. I'll link to the one that I read twice. It's a fantastic reading. I love recommending things that are free and accessible. But we are introduced to our main protagonist, pretty much the center of the book. There isn't a ton of plot other than a few moments where he's reminiscing, where he sits down and he writes to us. So this was a bureaucrat, someone who was sort of like a mid-level pencil pusher sort of guy who ended up falling into a little bit of family money and was able to retire at 40. And he sits down and kind of is reflecting back on his life. And he starts by, right from the gun, telling us that he's sour, he's bitter, he's ugly, he has no friends, nobody likes him, his life was hard. And I think the point that Dostoyevsky, and I do apologize, I'm almost certainly pronouncing that wrong, makes with this character is that you are kind of suffering from a little bit of whiplash, where in one instance he's truly embarrassing and insufferable. Some of the reviews for this book call him kind of a Michael Scott character, and I tend to think that's pretty accurate, is that he also ends up having this very accurate analysis of like the brokenness of society. And so a little bit of context about this book is that it was written in the 1840s, I believe, I'll put the date down here, when there were a lot of offshoots of ideals from the Enlightenment, which was this kind of movement that rejected this sort of mysticism and determination set forth by Catholic rule in this really heavy-handed way that basically said that all men are created equal and that we could live up to these higher ideals, that men are largely good with little flashes of irrationality. And in reality, Dostoyevsky sort of harbored this idea that we're actually pretty irrational, and that even if we are given what we want, we tend to find ways to be unhappy. I will say, I personally, while I agree with that, it's still my personal politic to push for basic human rights. So I think you can sort of, not to jump the gun and kind of give away the plot here, but I think The point is you can take sort of a broken framework that humans do tend towards irrationality, and that we have flashes of rationalism, and that even if we were given food and a living wage, we would still find ways to be happy, and yet still say it is a worthwhile cause to try to meet people's need and fight for human rights. You know what I mean? But he says that basically the human condition is to toil, is to become preoccupied with hierarchies. And he not only points this out in other people, again, accurately and correctly, and sort of sees society for what it is and the flaws, and yet pointing these things out don't make the main character any more right. I think the thing with the main character is on one hand, there's this tendency to kind of respect this dropout, better than society, I refuse to be a sellout kind of person. And yet the major flaw of this character isn't that he then completely rejects society and opts out whatever. There's supposedly maybe a utilitarian argument for why that might be a net good, but rather he still is deeply invested in these hierarchies. He thinks himself very, very high esteem in one instance, so high esteem that when there's a general in this park and they're walking and the general shows poor sidewalk etiquette, our main character becomes obsessed with this disrespectful moment, and for a year he plots this plan for how he's going to find this general in the park, and maybe he's going to sock him in the face, and he borrows money against his paycheck in order to buy this beautiful wardrobe to show him up. You can see that despite the fact that he kind of clocks the general for his flaws, again, accurately, a lot of this is inaction cloaked by accurate observations about the brokenness of society and the moral footing one gets from pointing that out. And yet he never ends up doing this. He goes to the park in his new outfit and chickens out at the last minute. And he talks about this a little bit in the beginning of the book, where he talks about how he's a mouse and that he's envious of the magnanimous, the person who is generous and not neurotic and can overlook things and confronts people when necessary, sort of this person who's like the opposite of our underground man, who goes forth. And the thing is, on one hand, when he's describing this person who actually goes out and does this in art terms, this is the person who wakes up and posts on Instagram, and even if the work isn't great, they still do it and they live to see another day. That he's both envious, but instead of the envy being a catalyst for him deciding to show up in his own way and maybe to a higher standard and his own set of values and ideals on his own platform, he instead takes this frustration and channels it into nitpicking and critiquing. There was a recent TikTok video that also, I think, kind of played into this, and if I can find it, I'll insert it here, where a creator says that basically a big part of what fuels haters is their own inner perfectionism, is that they wouldn't post that because they have a higher standard, but that same higher standard keeps them from actually posting or sharing anything. Because the truth is, for every wonderful painting you make, I am a full-time working artist, you're gonna have, depending on who you are and how you make art, 1, 2, 5, 10, 20 okay, mediocre, maybe even not good paintings that outweigh that. And I think it's understandable why someone might weigh those odds and not do it. But I think what ends up happening is that a lot of times that inaction and the way social media is set up leads to people being deeply, deeply critical and unkind. And, it's one thing, go be unkind to a stranger on the internet. That's obviously not good. But where I actually get the most worried is what it's like to live within that context. Because the more calcified by this inaction and this moral superiority and this taste superiority you become, the harder it is for you to eventually break down those walls and give yourself the space, grace, time, energy, love, kindness, compassion in order to do that for yourself. One thing I really enjoy about this book in the beginning is that he actually sits down and right from the jump says that overthinking is a sickness, a real sickness. And obviously the joke is, that's called anxiety and it does become a diagnosable illness. But I think whether or not you choose to pathologize that and fully make it a, diagnostic criteria of some kind, which is valid and fine, and I'm an artist and I don't weigh in on that. I think that's valid. I do think that can spill over sort of into art. In fact, I think a really good illustration of this actually comes from the movie Inside Out 2, which I saw with my kids. And anxiety was in the art room where dreams are projected, and anxiety, the emotion, ended up taking over and projecting all this what could happen if I did this and this could happen. And I think that's kind of the double bind of creative people who are really good at sort of visualizing and creating scenarios for good or for bad or neutral, end up being the kind of people who could play out what it's like to post a kind of horrible post and everyone thinks it's weird, and a gallery that was looking at you all of a sudden walks away from you. And the thing is, that kind of stuff does happen. The more you put yourself out there, the more that might happen. I wish I could sit here and tell you that no one cares. And, I remember with my age, half of my life was pre-internet being what it is, and the other half is post-internet being what it is. And there was a time when the advice that no one is thinking about you, no one cares, carried a lot of weight and was very consoling. The truth is, there might be people who are trapped in their own inaction, people who are sick with overthinking, that might really relish in you making a stinker post and losing followers and fizzling out and having a busy time period. But the thing is, those people, their punishment is that they have to live within a brain that needs that validation of other people failing in order to feel good about their own inaction. And the last thing I'll say about this is, I think that there's this tendency for artists to be pretty sensitive. Obviously, not all, I'm speaking in generalizations here. Pretty sensitive to the failings of our world and our society. And I see this a lot where I think there is a valid refusal to want to participate in society because it is so broken, it is so clearly sick. We do not value human life over things like property and capital and things that are pretty common sense. Even my 10-year-old can express that is not kind and fair and reasonable. Kids actually do have a pretty good sense of justice for what it's worth. But it's easy in a broken society to say, well, I don't need validation from it, I don't want to participate. But I think one of the more interesting things from the book, again, kind of happens in the beginning. He lays out his premise in the beginning, and then he has these examples. I don't want to have this full of spoilers, but I think, again, the healing and cathartic part of the book is seeing what this, dead right, accurate at clocking all the moral failings, and yet completely bound by inaction person, what that looks like in play. I think that's the cool part of the book. But in the beginning, he talks about how he's just a mouse. He lives on the crumbs. He watches the world from the floorboards. He lurks on his accounts, but never actually posts, so to speak. But in this book, it's very clear that he's sort of very critical of other people. And again, oftentimes correctly so. He sees through people. At one point, he meets this female character, and he completely tears her down for a system that she's participating in that will end up being harmful to her. On one hand, he really envies the magnanimous man. He wishes he had this status and that people looked up to him and liked him. And yet, he also finds solace in being the mouse and lurking from the floorboard and sort of having a lurk account but not actually posting anything. Because he says, if nothing else, at least there's a consolation that the mouse is not to blame, because the mouse isn't doing anything. But in reality, I am to blame. My view is that there's a bit of a self-selecting process here, where someone who truly was out on society and wanted a true Emerson, pulling back from society's broken, I want nothing to do with this, I'm going to go live in a commune and do my own thing. Obviously, there are philosophical arguments about the morality of that. Again, above my pay grade, I won't fully wade into that. But the thing is, if you are someone who criticizes and yet you check your phone and you are following closely what other people are doing wrong, you do care. You wouldn't be drawn to these things if you didn't think that you should have your art be part of this communication. If you didn't think that your ideas and your writing and your art and your music was meant to be part of the society, could better the world, could make you feel better, could connect you to people, could help you to find community, you wouldn't have the social media, I assume, for the most part. I'm sure there's exceptions. And so the people who criticize and lurk and are unkind and critical are often doing so out of a protection for the fear of their own inaction. If you're listening to this, I don't want you to feel like inaction in and of itself is the crime. Not at all. It's the inaction that's then sort of shrouded by moral correctness or just general correctness or taste correctness. Like, that's not good, my work would be better, or if I had time, my work would be better. Inaction can be a symptom of you're being overworked, you're taking care of a high needs relative or family member, or you're struggling with your own disabilities. And those things are all totally valid. I'm never gonna one-on-one not have compassion for someone's legitimate needs. And my whole philosophy is if it's valid to you, it's valid to me, right? I guess what I'm saying is, if you find yourself being comforted by the suffering, being comforted by other people's suffering, that I would take a moment and ask yourself if you are just a wounded creative and if you should create in some capacity. If you don't like the internet, if you don't have time for it, share and create with a community, contribute to local galleries, do something. But I'm telling you that the solve for this is action, is connection, is sharing, is making the bad piece of art that you would have judged someone else for, going to sleep, waking up, and living to see another day. And to round this out, with my own personal, again, why I was drawn to this book and my sort of history of origin, because I think had I not grown up in the exact house I grew up in, weirdly, I don't know that I would be as magnanimous, I guess, but like creative and sharing and high output as I am. Who I was really crystallized out of a reaction for who my dad was. I can remember very specifically this one memory of I was a cross country runner. My parents didn't support it. They really wanted me to just, work a job, and that was what I was meant to do. But I had this deal with them that if I kept up my grades and I was able to help contribute to rent and find my own rides to the meets and stuff, that they would let me run cross country and track. And I remember one year I made it to state, barely, by only a couple of spots. And I came home and I was excited to tell my parents that I made it to state. I was only 27th and you had to be top 30 to make it, so barely. And my dad, I remember, eviscerated me and said that I should be embarrassed and that was a horrible time. And I can remember in that moment sort of crystallizing and having this like full body reaction to, you're a miserable person and you're taking your misery out on me, and I will be nothing like you. I will create with reckless abandon. I too possess that ability to criticize and be analytical, and my inner perfectionist has a sharp tongue, and it can be hard to live with, but you deserve to heal from it, and you deserve to enjoy sharing what you're doing. It's not always easy. It's not for the faint. There are certainly moments where my vulnerability and my openness and my sharing and putting myself out there and occasionally sharing bad artwork and misses and fumbles, I know that there are probably people who are relishing in those moments, but I am relishing that I gave myself the kindness and compassion to have a creative life and to just see what my potential is. It may be less than what I had hoped, and that's okay. I think, the older you get, the more you start to take pride in little things, like, for example, simply showing up and choosing a creative life in a world that's very hostile to that. And you will grow mature enough that becomes really valuable. So I definitely recommend checking out the book. I hope I didn't give away too many spoilers. It is short. You can listen to it here. I'll put the link. And I just want to encourage you to create, to enjoy your one precious wild life, and that the connections that you'll make, even if they're few and far between, are worth any of the risk to putting yourself out there.